are going to talk about lesson 4. And today is interesting. It's about the Panama Canal. So, for a long time, everyone has thought that it would be a great idea to have a canal that would connect basically the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean, because you used to have to go all the way around South America to do that. And that's a much longer trip, makes things more expensive and more dangerous. So the first country that tried it, actually, the company was from France. And I'm going to show you video about it, but to make a long story short, they failed. It was much harder than they expected and much more expensive. They had a lot of problems. And the place that they tried was in Panama, which the narrowest part of Panama is called the Isthmus of Panama, because it is a very small piece of land connecting two larger bodies of land, meaning like all of North America and South America. So anyway, this failed. And so the U.S. decided that they would try a little bit later. And since some of the work was already done and everything, it's a good idea just go ahead and pick up where the French had done it. So the Americans are trying to make a deal with Colombia, actually. So Panama was not what Panama is now today. It was part of Colombia. So the Secretary of State, John Hay, tried to make a deal with the Colombians, and they almost did it. They had a treaty, and they were trying to pass it through, but it actually ended up failing. The Senate in Colombia actually ended up rejecting it. But the proposed deal was that we would control this strip of land, so we could build this canal for 99 years. And then we would pay them upfront $10 million, and then annually a rent of $250,000. Okay, and President Roosevelt didn't let that stop him, though. He was determined to have this happen, even though the Colombians denied the treaty. So what he did is he said, I'd be delighted if Panama would be independent, meaning go ahead and fight for your independence, revolt against the Colombians, and then, right, I'll be happy about it and I'll support you. So they took that to heart, and the Panamanians did actually revolt. The Americans under Roosevelt's rule, he sent a warship called the Nashville. And once they saw that they were going to have the American support in this, they went ahead and said, fine, we want independence from Colombia. Colombia, you can't, we're going to be independent. And of course, Colombia is like, no, you're not leaving us. So they were going to send forces to try to force them to come back and not let this happen. But the U.S. was there with the warship, right? And, not very many people can, go against that. So, Panama got its independence, and Roosevelt really quickly made the same deal pretty much with the Panamanians. And it'll be a 10-mile strip of land, the same deal though. And, of course you can understand that a lot of people thought that was actually not very cool, right? Even Americans. So most of Latin America thought that was not cool, that, we encouraged their people to revolt. And then even some Americans thought, that wasn't really the right way to do it. It's kind of backhanded, right? But he didn't care. Roosevelt thought it was worth it. And so we go ahead and start. And now we have a hard time, just like the French. It is very deadly. Because of all of the disease, yellow fever and malaria killed so many people that were working on this. And the only reason we really were able to be successful is because we had an army doctor named Dr. Gorgas who figured out that the diseases seemed to come from mosquitoes. And so he thought, okay, what can we do about that? So he ordered them to drain the swamps so there would be less mosquitoes around and therefore less disease around. And it worked. So he was really smart, and luckily they listened to him, and those measures did help. Okay. Anyway, so to make a long story short, they are successful in building the canal. And this is going to be a huge, win for America. And from now on, shipping things from, other countries, or even within our own country, right? Going across from New York to San Francisco, you can now sail through the canal instead of having to sail all the way down and around. And so the shipping costs are going to go way down, and the time, right? So that's going to be huge. So that's one. And then two, this is going to benefit our Navy, right? You remember how we've talked about a few examples now about how our naval power has been the thing that we've been like showing off, and being able to say, watch out, listen to us because we have this Navy. Well, now our Navy is got even more freedom, right? It can go really quickly between the Atlantic and the Pacific instead of having to go around. So that's going to add to our benefit of our Navy too. Of course, again, the Latin Americans maybe did not like us getting so involved in Latin America. We're going to be very protective of this new canal, and so we tend to get involved more often in Latin American region than we used to, and that ends up having some tensions with the other Latin American countries. And this is one of the interesting things that President Roosevelt, right, Teddy Roosevelt, he had this proverb he would say a lot. It was actually from an African proverb called "Speak softly and carry a big stick." And what that means is that you don't have to be all talk, right, and all yell and all you have to do is have the stick, meaning like the weapons, to back up what you want, right? And so he's saying, don't threaten anything. You actually go and make sure that people are doing what you want. And so he was willing, Roosevelt, to go ahead and get involved in these other countries. And he was going to make sure that things in the whole region went the way he thought that it should. Okay. And it's what he said was going to prevent anarchy, right? Disorder. So this leads us to this idea of the Roosevelt corollary. So first of all, if you remember a long time ago, we talked about the Monroe Doctrine. And if you remember, the Monroe Doctrine was us saying, oh, Europe, you all need to stay out of our hemisphere, our region. We're our own thing, and over here, and we don't appreciate you getting involved. And so especially right now, we're talking about in Latin America, right? And so Roosevelt adds on to that, and so that's what a corollary is, like an addition, something that comes on after it. And he said, and not only should everyone else stay out, but we, the United States, have the right, though, to get involved in Latin American countries that we think, if they're getting unstable or they could be dangerous for everyone in this region, we'll be the ones who kind of come in and make sure it goes right and be the police. Okay, and we actually did. It's kind of surprising if you think about it. In the Dominican Republic, we actually at one point took over the Dominican Republic, their at least their finances, because they had a revolution and their government was a mess. So we actually got involved in that. And then also in Cuba, they were having a revolution in Cuba, and then we sent troops there to interfere in that. So it's very Big Brother and getting involved in other people's business, which is way different than some presidents thought it should be. Okay, and so now we're going to talk about how the different presidents handled this new idea of us getting involved in foreign politics. So obviously Roosevelt was very willing to get involved. William Howard Taft, he actually, when he became president after Roosevelt, did not like the idea of going in with troops as much, but he did something called dollar diplomacy, meaning that he was going to use money to get what he wanted instead of um, right, the military. So he thought if we would make loans to these companies that are countries that are having issues, um, and put money in to help build roads and do all this infrastructure and things that would help them and us, right? We can trade with them and everything. So he thought if we put money into this situation, we can get what we want. But again, even that was seen as us, sticking our nose in other countries' business and maybe having undue influence, maybe even taking advantage of these situations for our own good. Okay. Mexico also is having a lot of problems, and we end up getting involved in that too. So Mexico had been, um, you know, a pretty poor country, but there are some people. The wealth is in a very small minority, right? And they own all the land. They're rich landowners. And us U.S. People came in and bought things up and took advantage of the situation. So there was a leader, a former Francisco Madero, and he did not like that, right? That it was benefiting the rich. And so he wanted it to be a bit more for the Mexican people, right? And not these foreigners and the rich. So he led a revolution, and he was successful for a very short amount of time. But then within 2 years, he was actually killed, assassinated. And the person who did that and took over was Huerta. And Huerta was for that opposite party, right? The ones who he's backed by the wealthy and the foreigners. So it became this very violent fight for Mexico and which way should it go. Now, at that time, then a new president took over, Woodrow Wilson, and Woodrow Wilson refused to recognize the official government being run by Huerta because everyone knew that Huerta had Madero killed, and so Woodrow Wilson said it was a government of butchers. I'm not going to recognize them as the rightful rulers of Mexico. So Wilson is known for something called moral diplomacy, meaning that he didn't think it was right that we went in and took over all these places. And he thought that, we can help guide places and, encourage democracy, right? Like we have, because we think that's the right way, but we're not going to come in and take over by force, right? Because that's morally not okay. And so the problem with that is when push comes to shove, like you can say you're not going to get involved, but, like for example, in Mexico, when Huerta is in charge and they have a civil war, right? The other side's trying to fight back and get it right for the people. And Huerta still kept control. And that's not what America wanted, right? And so we didn't get involved directly at first. We're trying to stay out of it, Wilson was. But then he sees that, they're not doing so well. So he actually says, okay, we'll sell guns and ammunition, arms, to the person who's got the best chance of fighting against Huerta, which was a guy named Carranza. And Carranza, so he basically helps him, even though, you kind of said you were going to stay out of it. But so is that morally, like you are taking sides and helping? And then there was a problem in one of the ports called Veracruz, where some U.S. sailors were arrested, and there was, they sent troops there to take over and try to, like, they got involved right after they kind of said they weren't going to, saying the reason they're doing it is because there's U.S. people, at stake. However, of course, having the U.S. troops in there is going to help their side of things, Carranza, right? And Carranza is able to take over and kind of win for a while because of the U.S. being there and helping. And so we ended up, right, Wilson said he was going to kind of stay out of it, but then he does end up picking a side and getting involved, right? So even after this time, though, it's still not like done. So again, more, Carranza's maybe seen as, being a puppet to the U.S., right? And a lot of people in Mexico are unhappy with him. And so one of the major people who led kind of a civil war in Mexico against him is Pancho Villa. So Pancho Villa was, unfortunately, he took it to the U.S. people that were living in Mexico as like we don't like that the U.S. is helping Carranza, and so we're going to, get through that by targeting Americans. So they killed some Americans, and he hoped, Pancho Villa, that, that would prove and show that the U.S. is interfering too much. Anyway, so they also burned down, they went across the border and went into New Mexico in the United States and killed 18 people there and burned down the town. So basically, when he gets so violent like that and he even comes into an America, then the U.S., of course, is pressuring the president to do something. So Wilson sends out someone, General Pershing, and his job was to go get Villa. So he chases him around for almost a year, even down into Mexico with his troops. So now he also is making the Mexicans, even on his side, mad, right? Carranza, who was helped by the U.S. and Wilson, he even doesn't like that the U.S. has troops in Mexico trying to chase around Pancho Villa. So it makes him look like he has no control, right? And the U.S. is doing whatever they want in Mexico. And so we probably would have likely maybe gotten into a war with Mexico over these issues. However, we're going to end up, getting distracted and get drawn into World War One, and so instead that happens. But had we not gotten distracted, I don't know, we might have ended up in a war with Mexico.